The male flight attendant walked past him 6 times without making eye contact. When he politely asked for water, he told him to wait. When he requested help with his seatbelt, he pointed to the instructions card with obvious irritation. Marcus had labeled him as just another difficult elderly passenger within minutes of boarding. He had no idea that the man he was dismissing had spent 40 years revolutionizing the very aircraft he worked on every day. Robert Miller sat quietly in seat 23B, watching the pre-flight preparations with the patient observation of someone who had seen this routine thousands of times before. At 72 years old, he had the weathered appearance of a man who had lived through decades of technological advancement, yet somehow seemed left behind by the modern world. His cardigan was well worn but clean. His shoes were practical rather than fashionable, and his silver hair was neatly combed in a style that hadn't changed since the 1980s. To the casual observer, and certainly to the flight crew, Robert looked exactly like what airline staff often dreaded: an elderly passenger who would need extra assistance, ask repetitive questions, and generally slow down the efficient boarding process that kept flights on schedule. Marcus Chen, the senior flight attendant on AeroWest Flight 447 from Denver to Seattle, had been working commercial flights for 8 years. In that time, he had developed what he considered to be excellent judgment about passengers. He could spot the business travelers who wanted to be left alone, the nervous flyers who would need reassurance, the families with young children who would require extra attention, and the elderly passengers who would inevitably become high-maintenance problems. Robert Miller, he had decided within moments of the old man's boarding, fell squarely into the latter category. The assessment had begun the moment Robert approached his seat. He had moved slowly down the aisle, checking seat numbers carefully as if unsure of his ability to count. He had struggled briefly with lifting his small carry-on bag into the overhead compartment, though he had politely declined help from other passengers. Most telling, in Marcus's opinion, was the way Robert had stared at the modern seatback entertainment system with apparent confusion, poking at the touchscreen with the uncertain movements of someone unfamiliar with contemporary technology. All of these observations confirmed Marcus's initial impression: Robert Miller was going to be work. "Excuse me," Robert had said quietly, pressing his call button for the first time about 20 minutes after takeoff. Marcus, who had been organizing the beverage cart, glanced up with barely concealed annoyance. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his tone professional but cool. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water when you have a moment?"
It was a perfectly reasonable request, delivered with old-fashioned politeness. But Marcus, already categorizing Robert as a passenger who would make multiple demands throughout the flight, responded with the minimum effort required. "We'll be starting beverage service in about 15 minutes, sir. I'll get to you then." Robert nodded and settled back into his seat without complaint, but Marcus noticed a slight look of disappointment that crossed the old man's face. Good, Marcus thought. Setting boundaries early prevented passengers from thinking they could make constant demands throughout the flight. 20 minutes later, when Marcus did reach Robert's row with the beverage cart, the interaction confirmed his expectations about difficult elderly passengers. "What can I get you to drink?" Marcus asked, already reaching for a plastic cup. "Just water, please," Robert replied. "And if it's not too much trouble, could you help me understand how to adjust this seat? The recline mechanism seems different from what I'm used to." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. Of course, the old man couldn't figure out a simple seat adjustment. "The button is on the right armrest, sir. You press it and lean back." Robert tried the button, but nothing happened. "I'm sorry, I think it might be—" "Let me," Marcus interrupted, reaching across Robert to forcefully press the recline button. The seat moved back about an inch. "There you go." "Thank you," Robert said quietly. "These modern aircraft certainly have more sophisticated systems than the planes I'm used to." Marcus barely registered the comment, already moving on to the next passenger. If he had been listening more carefully, he might have wondered what an elderly man in economy class meant by referring to planes I'm used to. But Marcus was focused on efficiency, not conversation. The pattern continued throughout the first hour of the flight. Robert asked for help finding the air conditioning controls. Marcus pointed to the overhead panel with obvious impatience. Robert inquired about the aircraft's estimated arrival time. Marcus told him to check the seatback screen, even though Robert had clearly been struggling.
Most significantly, Robert had been listening to the subtle changes in engine sounds and feeling the minor variations in aircraft movement that indicated the pilots were dealing with a minor navigation system malfunction. Nothing dangerous, but a technical issue that was requiring them to rely on backup systems and manual calculations rather than the automated flight management computer. Robert knew all of this because Robert Miller was not actually the confused, technologically challenged elderly passenger that Marcus assumed him to be. Robert Miller was the former chief engineer for AeroWest Airlines, the man who had designed many of the safety systems on the Boeing 737-800 they were currently flying, and the holder of 17 patents related to commercial aircraft navigation and emergency procedures. He was also the man who had personally trained more than half of the pilots currently employed by major airlines, written the emergency response manual that was sitting in the cockpit above their heads, and revolutionized commercial aviation safety in ways that had saved thousands of lives over the past 4 decades. But to Marcus, he was just Seat 23B, an annoying old man who asked too many questions. The irony was not lost on Robert. He had spent his career working to make air travel safer and more efficient, often focusing specifically on improving the passenger experience. He had designed systems to make emergency procedures more intuitive, developed technology to help flight crews better serve passengers with special needs, and written training materials to help airline staff provide excellent customer service. And now, in his retirement, he was experiencing firsthand how those same principles were being implemented, or in this case, ignored, by the next generation of airline employees. Robert had been listening to the subtle changes in engine sounds and feeling the minor variations in aircraft movement that indicated the pilots were dealing with a minor navigation system malfunction. Nothing dangerous, but a technical issue that was requiring them to rely on backup systems and manual calculations rather than the automated flight management computer. Robert knew all of this because Robert Miller was not actually the confused, technologically challenged elderly passenger that Marcus assumed him to be. Robert Miller was the former chief engineer for AeroWest Airlines, the man who had designed many of the safety systems on the Boeing 737-800 they were currently flying, and the holder of 17 patents related to commercial aircraft navigation and emergency procedures. He was also the man who had personally trained more than half of the pilots currently employed by major airlines, written the emergency response manual that was sitting in the cockpit above their heads, and revolutionized commercial aviation safety in ways that had saved thousands of lives over the past 4 decades. But to Marcus, he was just Seat 23B, an annoying old man who asked too many questions. The irony was not lost on Robert. He had spent his career working to make air travel safer and more efficient, often focusing specifically on improving the passenger experience. He had designed systems to make emergency procedures more intuitive, developed technology to help flight crews better serve passengers with special needs, and written training materials to help airline staff provide excellent customer service. And now, in his retirement, he was experiencing firsthand how those same principles were being implemented or in this case, ignored, by the next generation of airline employees. Robert could have resolved the situation easily. His identification badge from AeroWest, though he was now retired, still commanded instant respect from airline employees. A quiet word to Marcus about his background would have immediately transformed the quality of service he received. But Robert had learned long ago that the truest measure of an organization's culture was how it treated people who had no power or influence to demand better treatment. Marcus's behavior toward him was revealing important information about the airline's current training standards, its commitment to customer service, and the attitudes being fostered among frontline employees. This information was valuable, and Robert was gathering it methodically. Besides, Robert had endured far worse treatment than indifferent service from a flight attendant. He had worked in the aviation industry during decades when innovation required persistence, when new ideas were often met with skepticism, and when proving the value of safety improvements meant overcoming institutional resistance. A little rudeness from Marcus was insignificant compared to the satisfaction of knowing that the aircraft around them was operating according to principles he had helped establish. About 90 minutes into the flight, the situation began to change in ways that would ultimately reveal just how wrong Marcus's assumptions had been. It started with the turbulence. Not severe turbulence, nothing that posed any real danger to the aircraft or passengers, but rough air that required the flight crew to turn on the seatbelt sign and suspend cabin service temporarily. Marcus handled the situation competently, securing loose items and reassuring nervous passengers with the practiced efficiency of an experienced flight attendant. But Robert noticed something that Marcus missed. The turbulence pattern was unusual for this flight path and altitude. More importantly, the pilot's response suggested they were having to rely on manual weather radar interpretation rather than the integrated weather detection systems that should have been providing automatic guidance. Robert's suspicions were confirmed when he felt the subtle changes in engine power and aircraft attitude that indicated the pilots were making course corrections based on visual flight rules rather than instrument navigation. The backup systems were working perfectly, Robert knew because he had helped design them, but the primary navigation computer was clearly experiencing some kind of malfunction. It wasn't dangerous, the pilots were well trained, the backup systems were robust, and the weather conditions, while bumpy, were well within the aircraft's operational limits. But it was the kind of situation where Robert's expertise could be genuinely helpful, both to the flight crew and to the passengers who were becoming increasingly nervous about the continued turbulence. Robert waited, hoping that the crew would resolve the issue independently or that the primary systems would reset themselves automatically. But after 20 minutes of continued rough air and increasingly concerned murmurs from passengers, he made a decision. He pressed his call button. Marcus, who had been strapped into the flight attendant jump seat due to the ongoing turbulence, looked up with obvious frustration. He unbuckled himself and walked carefully to Robert's seat, gripping seat backs for balance.
"What do you need, sir?" Marcus asked, his tone making it clear that he considered this interruption both inappropriate and predictable from a passenger he had already categorized as problematic. "I wanted to ask about the turbulence," Robert said quietly. "Is everything all right with the aircraft's navigation systems?" Marcus stared at him with unconcealed irritation. "Sir, turbulence is completely normal during flight. The pilots are handling the situation professionally, and there's no need for passenger concern." It was a textbook response, accurate, reassuring, and appropriate for most passenger inquiries about turbulence. But Robert's question had been more specific and more informed than Marcus realized. "I understand that turbulence is normal," Robert replied calmly. but I'm wondering specifically about the navigation systems. The flight pattern suggests the crew might be flying manually rather than using the automated flight management computer. Marcus's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching alarm. Passengers weren't supposed to be able to detect subtle differences in flight operations, and they certainly weren't supposed to ask informed questions about aircraft systems. "Sir, I need you to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. The pilots are in complete control of the aircraft, and passengers are not qualified to assess flight operations." It was a textbook response, accurate, reassuring, and appropriate for most passenger inquiries about turbulence. But Robert's question had been more specific and more informed than Marcus realized. "I understand that turbulence is normal," Robert replied calmly, "but I'm wondering specifically about the navigation systems. The flight pattern suggests the crew might be flying manually rather than using the automated flight management computer." Marcus's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching alarm. Passengers weren't supposed to be able to detect subtle differences in flight operations, and they certainly weren't supposed to ask informed questions about aircraft systems. "Sir, I need you to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. The pilots are in complete control of the aircraft, and passengers are not qualified to assess flight operations." It was a textbook response, accurate, reassuring, and appropriate for most passenger inquiries about turbulence. But Robert's question had been more specific and more informed than Marcus realized.
More concerning was Marcus's immediate assumption that any passenger asking technical questions must be uninformed and potentially troublesome. This attitude indicated that airline training was not adequately preparing flight attendants to recognize when passengers might actually have relevant expertise. 15 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that would change the entire dynamic of the flight. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Williams speaking. We've been experiencing some minor technical issues with our primary navigation system, which has required us to use backup procedures for the past 30 minutes. There's no safety concern, but we will be arriving in Seattle approximately 20 minutes behind schedule due to the slightly longer flight path we've had to take." The announcement was professional and appropriately reassuring, but Robert noticed that several passengers looked concerned about the mention of technical issues. He also noticed that Marcus appeared surprised by the captain's candor about the navigation problems, suggesting that the flight attendants had not been fully briefed about the situation. As the aircraft continued toward Seattle, Robert reflected on what he had observed during the flight. Marcus's treatment of him had been unnecessarily dismissive, but it was consistent with broader problems he had seen developing in the airline industry over the past decade. Cost-cutting measures had reduced training time for flight attendants. Emphasis on efficiency had sometimes come at the expense of genuine customer service. And the increasingly complex technology in modern aircraft had created a gap between what passengers could observe and what crew members were trained to discuss. These were systemic issues that went far beyond Marcus's individual behavior, but they were also issues that Robert was uniquely positioned to address if he chose to do so. Robert had been planning to spend his retirement quietly, traveling occasionally, and enjoying the freedom from the demands of his engineering career. But the events of this flight were reminding him that his expertise and experience might still have value, particularly in helping the airline industry continue to improve safety and customer service standards. As they began their descent into Seattle, Robert made a decision that would ultimately transform not just Marcus's understanding of customer service, but the training and operations of Aero West Airlines as a whole. He was going to reveal who he really was, but not in a way that would humiliate Marcus. Robert had spent 40 years solving complex engineering problems. Now he was going to apply those same problem-solving skills to a human challenge, helping Marcus learn that assumptions about people based on appearance could be not just wrong, but dangerously limiting. The approach to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was smooth, despite the navigation system issues that had caused the earlier turbulence. As the aircraft descended through the cloud layer and the lights of the city became visible below, Robert prepared for a conversation that would be unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his 8 years of airline service. But first, he wanted to give Marcus one final opportunity to demonstrate the customer service standards that Robert hoped were still being taught to Aero West employees. As the seatbelt sign chimed off and passengers began to stir in preparation for arrival, Robert pressed his call button one last time.
Marcus approached Robert's seat with the same wary expression he had worn throughout the flight. The call button from 23B represented, in his mind, one final annoyance from a passenger who had already proven himself to be exactly the high-maintenance elderly traveler that Marcus had predicted. "Yes, sir," Marcus said, standing in the aisle with barely concealed impatience. "We'll be landing in about 15 minutes, so I'll need to ask you to keep your requests brief." Robert looked up at the young flight attendant with calm, steady eyes. "Marcus, I wanted to thank you for your service during the flight. I know dealing with passengers can be challenging, and I appreciate the work you do." The unexpected gratitude caught Marcus off guard. In 8 years of airline service, he had rarely received unsolicited thanks from passengers, especially not from ones he had categorized as difficult. He felt a brief moment of guilt about his attitude toward Robert, but quickly suppressed it. "You're welcome, sir," Marcus replied automatically. "Is there anything else you need?" Robert smiled gently. "Actually, there is something I'd like to discuss with you if you have a moment. It's about the navigation system issues we experienced during the flight." Marcus's expression immediately hardened again. "Sir, as I explained earlier, passengers are not qualified to assess aircraft operations. The pilots handled the situation appropriately and—" "Marcus," Robert interrupted quietly, "what if I told you that I am qualified to assess aircraft operations?" Something in Robert's tone made Marcus pause. The old man wasn't speaking with the confused uncertainty that had characterized his earlier questions. There was a subtle authority in his voice that Marcus had never heard before. "Sir, I don't understand what you mean." Robert reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet, worn but well-maintained. From it, he extracted a card and handed it to Marcus. Marcus looked down at the identification card and felt his world shift suddenly and completely. The card bore the Aero West Airlines logo at the top. Below it was a photo of Robert Miller, clearly taken several years earlier, but unmistakably the same. Marcus stared at the card for several long seconds, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The elderly passenger he had dismissed, ignored, and treated with barely concealed contempt throughout the flight was not just any retired engineer. He was Robert Miller, a name that Marcus recognized from training materials, safety bulletins, and company communications. Robert Miller was a legend in the aviation industry. He was the man who had designed many of the safety systems on the aircraft they were currently flying. He was the engineer whose innovations had prevented countless accidents and saved thousands of lives. He was the person whose training materials Marcus himself had studied during his certification process. And Marcus had treated him like an annoying, incompetent old man for the entire flight. I don't, Marcus stammered, his face draining of color as the implications of his behavior became clear. "It's all right, Marcus," Robert said gently. "You couldn't have known who I was. And to be honest, that's exactly why this conversation is important." Marcus felt his hands beginning to shake slightly as he held the identification card. "Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I had known—" "If you had known, you would have treated me differently," Robert finished. "And that's precisely the problem I'd like to discuss with you." Other passengers were beginning to notice the conversation. The woman in 23A had put down her magazine and was listening with obvious curiosity. The businessman across the aisle was craning his neck to see what was happening.
Marcus became acutely aware that his professional reputation was about to be examined in the most public and humbling way possible. "The question isn't whether you would have treated me better if you had known my background. The question is why you didn't treat me with basic courtesy and respect simply because I was a paying passenger who deserved good service." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but found himself without words. Every excuse he might offer, that Robert seemed confused, that elderly passengers were often demanding, that he was busy with other duties, sounded petty and unprofessional when held up against the simple principle Robert was expressing.
"Mr. Miller," Marcus finally managed. "I realize I made mistakes during this flight. I should have been more attentive to your needs, and I should have taken your technical questions more seriously." "That's a start," Robert replied. "But I want you to understand that this isn't really about my needs or my technical questions. This is about the fundamental approach to customer service that you demonstrated today." Robert gestured toward the other passengers, several of whom were now openly listening to the conversation. "Every person on this aircraft paid for their ticket and deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That includes the business travelers in first class, the families with young children, the nervous flyers who ask lots of questions, and yes, the elderly passengers who might need a little extra assistance." Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks as he realized how clearly his priorities had been revealed through his behavior. He had indeed treated different passengers differently based on his assumptions about their status, their importance, and their likely impact on his workload. "You're right," Marcus said quietly. "I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and age, and I let those assumptions affect the quality of service I provided." "Now we're getting somewhere," Robert said with approval. "Can you help me understand what led to those assumptions?" It was a question that required Marcus to examine his own attitudes and training in a way that was both uncomfortable and necessary. He looked around the cabin, aware that his response would be heard by other passengers, but realizing that the conversation had moved beyond his personal embarrassment to something more important. I think I've been trained to see passengers as problems to be managed rather than people to be served," Marcus said slowly. "Elderly passengers, in particular, have a reputation for needing more time and attention, and I've learned to minimize those interactions, to stay efficient." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "That's an honest answer, and it reveals something important about how airline training has evolved. Efficiency is important, but it should never come at the expense of basic human courtesy." He paused, glancing around at the passengers who were listening. "Marcus, do you know why I originally went into aviation engineering?" Marcus shook his head. "Because I wanted to make flying safer and more comfortable for passengers. Every system I designed, every safety protocol I developed, every training manual I wrote was focused on one goal: ensuring that people like everyone on this aircraft could travel with confidence and dignity." Robert's voice carried a quiet passion that made it clear this wasn't just a career for him, it had been a calling. "When I see flight attendants treating passengers with indifference or impatience, it defeats the purpose of everything I spent my career trying to achieve. The most sophisticated safety systems in the world don't matter if passengers don't trust the crew or feel valued as human beings." Marcus was beginning to understand that his behavior represented something larger than individual rudeness. His attitude toward Robert reflected systemic problems in airline training and culture that undermined the very purposes that people like Robert had spent their careers trying to advance. "What can I do to be better?" Marcus asked, and for the first time during the flight, his question seemed genuinely motivated by a desire to learn, rather than simply to end an uncomfortable conversation. Robert smiled, and Marcus saw warmth in his expression that had been absent during all their previous interactions. The first step is recognizing that every passenger interaction is an opportunity to demonstrate the values that aviation professionals should embody: safety, service, and respect for the people who trust us with their lives. Robert gestured toward his seat and the aircraft around them. You are working in one of the most remarkable achievements of human engineering and cooperation. Every flight represents thousands of people working together: engineers, pilots, maintenance crews, air traffic controllers, ground personnel, all focused on getting passengers safely from one place to another. He looked directly at Marcus. As a flight attendant, you're the human face of that entire system. For most passengers, you represent everything they think and feel about aviation. That's both a tremendous responsibility and a tremendous opportunity. Marcus found himself nodding as Robert's words helped him see his job in a completely new light. Instead of viewing passengers as obstacles to efficient operations, he could understand them as the entire purpose of the aviation system's existence. But how do I balance that with the practical demands of the job? Marcus asked. There really are time pressures, and some passengers really do require more attention than others. Excellent question, Robert replied. The answer isn't to lower your standards for difficult situations. The answer is to develop systems and approaches that allow you to maintain high standards efficiently. Robert reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small notebook. For 40 years, I've been observing airline operations and taking notes on what works and what doesn't. Would you like to hear some practical suggestions? Marcus nodded eagerly, aware that he was receiving personalized training from one of the most respected figures in the aviation industry. First, treat initial passenger interactions as investments rather than interruptions. Spending an extra 30 seconds being genuinely helpful early in the flight often prevents multiple requests later. Robert flipped through his notebook. Second, recognize that passengers asking technical questions aren't necessarily being difficult. They might be engineers, pilots, or other aviation professionals. Or they might simply be curious people who want to understand their experience better. Marcus thought about his dismissive response to Robert's questions about the navigation system. If he had taken those questions seriously, he might have learned something valuable and built rapport with a passenger instead of creating frustration. Third, Robert continued, remember that excellent customer service often requires less time than poor customer service. Answering questions clearly the first time prevents follow-up requests. Addressing passenger concerns proactively prevents escalation to supervisors or complaints. These were principles that Marcus had never been taught explicitly, despite his years of training and experience. They represented a more sophisticated understanding of customer service that went beyond simple politeness to strategic thinking about human interactions. Mr. Miller, would you be willing to share these observations with our training department? It sounds like there are systematic improvements that could benefit all of our flight attendants. Robert looked pleased by the suggestion. I'd be very interested in that conversation. But first, I want to make sure you understand how to apply these principles in your own work. Over the remaining 10 minutes of the flight, as the aircraft completed its approach to Seattle, Robert engaged Marcus in a detailed discussion about customer service philosophy, practical techniques for managing difficult situations, and the broader purpose of aviation as a service to humanity. Other passengers listened with fascination as the conversation evolved from a correction of Marcus's behavior to a masterclass in professional aviation service. Several passengers took notes, and Marcus realized that Robert was simultaneously teaching him and demonstrating for everyone on the aircraft what constructive educational leadership looked like. As the aircraft touched down smoothly at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Marcus felt like he had received more valuable professional development in 20 minutes than in his previous 8 years of airline employment. "Mr. Miller," Marcus said as passengers began to prepare for deplaning, "I want to apologize again for my behavior during this flight, and I want to thank you for taking the time to help me understand how I can do better." "Marcus, your willingness to listen and learn tells me that you have the potential to become an exceptional flight attendant," Robert replied. "The aviation industry needs people who understand that technical excellence and human dignity are equally important." Robert stood up and began gathering his belongings, moving with the same deliberate pace that had initially caused Marcus to categorize him as a slow, confused passenger. But now Marcus saw the same movements as evidence of methodical thinking and careful attention to detail, qualities that had undoubtedly contributed to Robert's success as an engineer. "Before you go," Marcus said, "could I ask you one more question?" "Of course." "How often do you fly? And do you always observe operations the way you did today?" Robert chuckled. "I fly fairly regularly, and yes, I'm always observing, not because I'm looking for problems, but because I'm genuinely interested in how the systems I helped create are working in practice."
He paused thoughtfully. "Marcus, every flight teaches me something new about aviation operations. Today's flight taught me that there are dedicated airline employees like you who are willing to learn and grow when given the opportunity." As passengers began moving toward the exit, several stopped to speak with Robert. A businessman thanked him for the fascinating conversation about customer service. A woman traveling with her elderly mother said she appreciated seeing someone address ageism so constructively. A young man studying engineering asked Robert about career opportunities in aviation. Marcus watched these interactions with new understanding. Robert wasn't just an accomplished engineer. He was a natural teacher who had the ability to turn any situation into a learning opportunity for everyone involved. As Robert prepared to leave the aircraft, he handed Marcus a business card. "If you're serious about that conversation with your training department, have them contact me. I'd be happy to share some observations about how airline customer service training could be improved." Marcus looked at the card, which listed Robert's credentials and contact information, along with a simple tagline, "Making aviation safer and more human." "I will definitely pass this along," Marcus promised. "And Mr. Miller, thank you for treating us as a teaching moment instead of just filing a complaint." Robert smiled. "Marcus, complaints might get you disciplined, but they wouldn't help you become a better flight attendant. My goal wasn't to get you in trouble. It was to help you understand why this work matters." As Robert walked up the jetway toward the terminal, Marcus realized that the elderly passenger he had dismissed at the beginning of the flight had given him the most valuable professional lesson of his career. But more than that, Robert had demonstrated something profound about leadership, education, and human dignity. Instead of using his authority and expertise to humiliate Marcus, he had used them to uplift him. Instead of focusing on punishment, he had focused on growth. Instead of treating Marcus the way Marcus had treated him, he had modeled the respect and courtesy that should characterize all human interactions. Marcus stood in the aircraft cabin as the last passengers deplaned, holding Robert's business card and thinking about everything that had happened during the flight. In the span of a few hours, his understanding of his job, his approach to customer service, and his assumptions about people had been completely transformed. He had learned that appearances could be profoundly deceiving, that every passenger deserved respect regardless of their apparent status, and that the most valuable lessons often came from the most unexpected teachers. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had learned that mistakes could become opportunities for growth when met with the right combination of humility, curiosity, and commitment to doing better. As he began his post-flight duties, he found himself looking forward to his next shift with a renewed sense of purpose and a completely new understanding of what it meant to serve passengers with excellence and dignity. The elderly man in seat 23B had indeed changed everything about how Marcus approached his work, but the transformation had been accomplished not through criticism or
6 months after that transformative flight from Denver to Seattle, Marcus Chen stood before a room full of new Aero West flight attendant trainees holding the same business card that Robert Miller had given him on that life-changing day. What had started as a personal lesson in humility had evolved into something much larger, a complete overhaul of how the airline approached customer service training. Before we begin today's session, Marcus told the 23 trainees seated before him, "I want to share a story about the most important lesson I learned in 8 years of airline service. It's a lesson that came from a passenger I almost overlooked entirely." If you've been moved by this story of transformation and second chances, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that will change how you see the people around you. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could transform your perspective on life. Marcus had been promoted to senior training coordinator just 3 months after his encounter with Robert Miller. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and implement Robert's suggestions had caught the attention of Aero West management, who were looking for ways to improve their consistently low customer service ratings. The passenger in seat 23B looked exactly like what I thought would be a problem, Marcus continued, clicking to the first slide of his presentation. Elderly, confused by technology, asking questions that seemed basic. I treated him with the bare minimum courtesy required by company policy. The trainees listened intently as Marcus described his assumptions, his dismissive behavior, and the gradual realization that he was dealing with one of the most respected figures in aviation history. "But here's what I want you to understand," Marcus said, advancing to a slide showing passenger satisfaction statistics. "This story isn't really about mistaking a famous engineer for an ordinary passenger. It's about the fundamental approach we take to every person who steps onto our aircraft." One of the trainees, a young woman named Jennifer, raised her hand. "How do we balance excellent service with efficiency requirements? We're taught that delays cost the airline money." Marcus smiled, recognizing the same mindset he had once held. "That's exactly the question I asked Mr. Miller, and his answer changed how I think about efficiency entirely." "Mr. Miller taught me that exceptional service often takes less time than poor service," Marcus explained. "When you address a passenger's needs completely the first time, you prevent follow-up requests, complaints, and escalations that actually consume more time and resources." He clicked to a case study slide. "In my first month implementing Mr. Miller's principles, I reduced my average passenger interaction time by 15% while increasing my customer satisfaction scores by 40%. Not because I was working faster, but because I was working smarter." The training session continued for 2 hours, with Marcus walking the new flight attendants through practical scenarios and techniques that Robert had shared. But the most powerful part of the training wasn't the techniques, it was the fundamental shift in perspective about what their job really meant. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of mentorship and second chances. Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear these life-changing stories. During the break, Marcus checked his phone and found a message from Robert Miller.
Just finished reviewing the quarterly customer service reports. Aero West's improvements are remarkable. You should be proud of the culture change you're helping create." The transformation had indeed been remarkable. In the 6 months since Marcus began incorporating Robert's principles into his work, Aero West had seen a 35% improvement in customer satisfaction scores, a 20% reduction in passenger complaints, and a 25% improvement in online reviews specifically mentioning flight attendant service. But the changes went beyond statistics. Marcus had noticed that passengers seemed more relaxed, crew members appeared more confident, and the overall atmosphere on flights had become noticeably more positive. The ripple effect of treating people with genuine respect extends far beyond individual interactions, Marcus told the trainees as they reconvened. When passengers feel valued, they're more cooperative, more patient, and more likely to treat crew members with respect in return. Make sure you're subscribed because next week we're sharing the story of a janitor who revolutionized an entire hospital through the power of observation and kindness. These stories prove that extraordinary change can come from the most unexpected places. Jennifer raised her hand again. Have you stayed in touch with Robert Miller? Has he been involved in developing this training program?
Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Mr. Miller has become an unofficial consultant for our customer service improvements. He's helped us redesign several training modules and has even guest lectured for our senior staff development programs. The truth was that Robert had become something of a legend within Aero West. His insights had influenced everything from crew scheduling policies to aircraft interior design recommendations. But more than his technical expertise, it was his approach to human interactions that had created lasting change. Hit the subscribe button right now if you want to discover more stories about how wisdom and experience can guide us toward better ways of treating each other. These lessons could transform your workplace relationships forever. Mr. Miller taught me that every passenger interaction is an opportunity to demonstrate the values that aviation professionals should embody: safety, service, and respect for the people who trust us with their lives. Marcus advanced to a slide showing photos from various Aero West flights over the past 6 months. Images of flight attendants engaging positively with passengers of all ages, backgrounds, and apparent circumstances. These photos represent the cultural shift that began with one conversation on one flight. Each of these flight attendants is now applying the principles Mr. Miller shared with me, and they're seeing the same results: happier passengers, smoother flights, and more job satisfaction. One of the trainees, a middle-aged man who is changing careers to become a flight attendant, asked, "What would have happened if you had reacted defensively when Mr. Miller revealed his identity?" Subscribe and turn on notifications because we're constantly sharing stories that show how our reactions to criticism can determine whether we grow or stay stuck in limiting patterns. Marcus paused thoughtfully. That's probably the most important question you could ask. If I had become defensive or if I had tried to make excuses for my behavior, I would have missed the opportunity to learn from one of the most knowledgeable people in our industry. He clicked to a slide titled, "The Growth Mindset in Customer Service." Mr. Miller didn't approach the situation to humiliate me or get me in trouble. He approached it as a teaching opportunity. But that only worked because I was willing to listen, acknowledge my mistakes, and commit to doing better. The training session concluded with role-playing exercises, where trainees practiced applying Robert's principles to various challenging passenger scenarios. Marcus watched with satisfaction as the new flight attendants demonstrated genuine empathy, curiosity about passengers' needs, and respect for diverse backgrounds and circumstances. Don't miss our upcoming series on workplace transformation stories.
Subscribe now so you'll be the first to see how small changes in attitude can create massive improvements in career success and job satisfaction. After the trainees left, Marcus remained in the conference room to prepare for his next session, a workshop for experienced flight attendants who were struggling with the cultural changes Aero West was implementing. These sessions were often more challenging because veteran employees sometimes resisted new approaches to familiar problems.
His phone buzzed with another message from Robert. "I'll be flying Aero West next week for a consulting project. Would you like me to observe some of your team's work and provide feedback?" Marcus smiled and typed back, "That would be incredible. I think seeing you interact with passengers would be invaluable training for our staff." The relationship between Marcus and Robert had evolved far beyond their initial encounter. Robert had become a mentor, helping Marcus understand not just customer service techniques, but the broader principles of leadership, continuous improvement, and professional development. Make sure you're following our channel because we regularly feature stories about mentorship relationships that change entire industries. These connections prove that learning never stops, regardless of age or experience level. But perhaps more importantly, Robert had helped Marcus understand that his work as a flight attendant was part of something much larger than individual job performance. Every flight represented thousands of people working together to make air travel safe, efficient, and accessible. Marcus's role was to be the human face of that entire system. This perspective had transformed how Marcus approached not just difficult passengers, but every aspect of his work. He now saw scheduled delays as opportunities to provide exceptional communication, rather than sources of frustration. He viewed passenger questions as chances to share knowledge, rather than interruptions to his routine. Most significantly, he had learned to see every passenger as a person deserving respect, rather than a problem to be managed. Subscribe immediately if you want access to more stories that show how changing your perspective can completely transform your experience at work and in life. These insights are practical wisdom you can apply starting today. The cultural transformation at Aero West had not been gone unnoticed by other airlines. Marcus had received inquiries from 3 competing carriers asking about the training methods that had produced such dramatic improvements in customer satisfaction. He had also been invited to speak at 2 industry conferences about customer service innovation. The most surprising thing about implementing Mr. Miller's principles, Marcus often told these audiences, is that they made my job easier, not harder. When you treat passengers with genuine respect and competence, they respond with cooperation and appreciation. The success had led to Marcus being offered several promotions within Aero West, including positions in management and corporate training. But he had chosen to remain in a role that allowed him to work directly with flight attendants, believing that frontline customer service was where he could make the greatest impact. Hit subscribe and the notification bell because next month we're releasing an exclusive interview with both Marcus and Robert Miller, discussing how their relationship developed and what lessons other professionals can apply to their own careers. As Marcus packed up his training materials, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that flight from Denver to Seattle. What had begun as a humbling correction of his customer service approach had evolved into a new career focus, a mentoring relationship, and a completely different understanding of professional purpose. But the most valuable lesson hadn't been about customer service techniques or airline operations. It had been about humility, openness to learning, and the recognition that wisdom could come from the most unexpected sources. Robert Miller had looked exactly like the kind of passenger Marcus thought he could dismiss without consequence. Instead, he had turned out to be the teacher Marcus didn't know he needed, offering lessons that would benefit not just Marcus, but thousands of passengers and hundreds of airline employees. Don't forget to subscribe because we believe that everyone has something valuable to teach us, and every interaction is an opportunity to learn something that could change our lives. These stories will remind you to keep your mind open to wisdom from unexpected sources. The story of Seat 23B had become legendary within Aero West, shared in training sessions, referenced in communications, and retold by employees who understood that it represented something fundamental about treating people with dignity regardless of appearances.
But for Marcus, it would always be more than a training story. It was the moment when he learned that assumptions could be dangerous, that respect should be universal, and that the willingness to acknowledge mistakes and learn from them was one of the most valuable professional skills anyone could develop. As he left the training facility that evening, Marcus looked forward to Robert's upcoming visit. There would be more opportunities to observe, learn, and continue growing in his understanding of what excellent customer service really meant. Subscribe right now and join thousands of others who are committed to treating every person they meet with the respect and dignity they deserve. These stories will inspire you to see possibilities instead of problems in every interaction you have. The elderly man in seat 23B had indeed changed everything about how Marcus approached his work and his life. But more than that, Robert Miller had demonstrated that the most powerful way to address mistakes was through education rather than punishment, growth rather than blame, and hope rather than criticism. Make sure you're subscribed to catch our next story about how one conversation can create ripple effects that transform entire organizations. Hit that notification bell so you never miss content that could change how you approach your relationships and career forever.
2 years after the encounter that changed his life, Marcus Chen stood in the departure lounge of Denver International Airport, waiting for flight AW447, the same route where he had first met Robert Miller. But this time, he wasn't working as a flight attendant. He was traveling as Aero West's newly appointed Director of Customer Experience Innovation, heading to Seattle for a company-wide presentation that would revolutionize how the entire airline industry approached passenger service. The transformation had been extraordinary. What started as one conversation between a dismissed passenger and a humbled flight attendant had evolved into the most successful customer service initiative in commercial aviation history. Subscribe to our channel if you want to see more stories about how single moments of learning can create industry-wide transformation. Hit that notification bell because these success stories will show you how to turn your biggest mistakes into your greatest achievements. As Marcus waited to board, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The Miller method, as it had come to be known within the industry, wasn't just a set of customer service techniques. It was a complete philosophy about human dignity, professional excellence, and the power of treating every interaction as an opportunity for positive impact. The success had been measurable from the very beginning. In the first year after implementing Robert's principles, Aero West had seen 45% improvement in customer satisfaction scores, 60% reduction in passenger complaints, 35% increase in customer loyalty and repeat bookings, 28% improvement in employee job satisfaction, recognition as Airline of the Year by 3 major travel publications. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation had been cultural, affecting how thousands of employees approached their work and how millions of passengers experienced air travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because next week we're sharing the incredible story of how this customer service revolution spread to hospitals, hotels, and retail chains across the country. These principles can transform any workplace relationship. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Robert Miller. "Looking forward to your presentation today. I'll be in the audience, probably sitting in the back and taking notes as usual." The relationship between Marcus and Robert had become the foundation for everything that followed. What had begun as a mentoring relationship had evolved into a true partnership, with Robert serving as senior consultant for Aero West's Customer Experience Division and Marcus implementing the day-to-day operations of their revolutionary approach. But the impact had extended far beyond Aero West. 3 competing airlines had licensed the Miller method for their own operations. 2 major hotel chains had adapted the principles for hospitality service. A large hospital system had implemented the approach in their patient relations program. Make sure you're subscribed to see how one elderly passenger's wisdom created a movement that's changing how entire industries think about customer service and human dignity. As Flight AW447 began boarding, Marcus noticed something that would have been impossible 2 years ago. The boarding process itself had been completely transformed. Instead of the rushed, impersonal efficiency that had characterized airline operations, passengers were greeted individually, assisted proactively, and treated with the kind of genuine warmth that made people feel valued rather than processed. The flight attendant at the gate, a young woman named Patricia, who had graduated from Marcus's training program just 6 months earlier, exemplified the new approach. She made eye contact with each passenger, offered specific assistance based on their apparent needs, and maintained the kind of genuine warmth that made people feel valued rather than processed. "Mr. Chen," Patricia said as Marcus approached the gate, "it's an honor to have you on our flight today. I wanted you to know that your training program completely changed how I think about this work." Marcus smiled, remembering his own transformation. "That's wonderful to hear, Patricia. But remember, the real credit goes to the passengers who trust us with their journeys. They're the reason we're all here." Subscribe right now if you believe that excellent customer service starts with remembering that every person deserves respect and dignity. These stories will inspire you to see service as an opportunity rather than an obligation. Once aboard the aircraft, Marcus was surprised to find Robert Miller already seated in 23B, the same seat where their first conversation had taken place. At 74, Marcus moved a bit more slowly than he had 2 years ago, but his eyes still held the same keen intelligence and warmth that made such an impact on Marcus's life. "Mr. Miller," Marcus said, stopping by Robert's seat, "I should have known you'd choose the same seat." Robert chuckled. "Some things are worth commemorating. Besides, 23B has become my favorite spot for observing how well our principles are being implemented." As Marcus took his seat in first class, a perk of his new executive position, he marveled at how completely the aircraft experience had changed. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with purpose and genuine care. Passengers seemed more relaxed and cooperative. Even the pre-flight safety demonstration had been redesigned to be more engaging and personal. Hit subscribe and the notification bell because we're about to share the specific techniques that transformed this airline from average to exceptional. These methods can be applied in any customer-facing role. During the flight, Marcus worked on his presentation, reviewing the data and case studies that would be shared with airline executives from around the world. The Seattle conference represented the official launch of the Miller method as a licensed customer service system available to any organization committed to treating people with dignity and respect. But as Marcus prepared his materials, his mind wandered to the broader implications of what they had accomplished. The principles Robert had shared weren't really about customer service. They were about recognizing the humanity in every person we encounter, regardless of their appearance, background, or apparent status.
Subscribe to our channel because we regularly feature stories about how treating people with respect creates positive changes that extend far beyond business success into personal fulfillment and community transformation. The presentation in Seattle was scheduled to take place in the same conference center where, 2 years earlier, Marcus had attended his first aviation industry customer service seminar. At that time, he had been a struggling flight attendant, trying to understand why passenger satisfaction scores were declining despite increased efficiency measures. Now, he was returning as a keynote speaker, sharing insights that had revolutionized an entire industry's approach to human interaction. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most valuable lesson of his career had come not from a professional development seminar or management training program, but from a passenger he had initially dismissed as unimportant. Make sure you're following our channel, because next month we're releasing an exclusive documentary about how the Miller Method has been implemented in healthcare, education, and retail industries with remarkable results. As the aircraft began its descent into Seattle, Marcus reflected on the letters and emails he had received from employees at other companies who had implemented the Miller Method principles. A hotel desk clerk in Chicago wrote about how the approach had helped her assist international guests more effectively. A hospital nurse in Phoenix described how the principles had improved her relationships with both patients and their families. A retail manager in Atlanta explained how the method had reduced employee turnover and increased customer loyalty. Each story reinforced Robert's original insight. Treating people with genuine respect and dignity wasn't just morally right, it was also the most effective approach to creating positive outcomes for everyone involved. Don't miss our upcoming series on workplace transformation. Subscribe now to see how these principles have created positive changes in schools, government offices, and nonprofit organizations across the country. During the landing, Marcus noticed that even this routine procedure had been enhanced by the Miller Method. The flight attendants moved through the cabin thanking passengers individually for choosing AeroWest, offering specific assistance with connecting flights, and maintaining the kind of personal attention that made people feel genuinely appreciated. After deplaning, Marcus and Robert walked together through Seattle-Tacoma International Airport toward the conference center. The airport itself had become a case study in customer service excellence, having implemented many of the Miller Method principles in their ground operations.
Subscribe immediately if you want to learn how organizational culture change starts with individual commitment to treating every person with respect and dignity. These lessons apply whether you're in customer service or any other field. Marcus, Robert said as they approached the conference center, I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. But more importantly, I'm proud of who you've become as a leader and as a person. The comment meant more to Marcus than any professional recognition or award. Robert had become not just a mentor, but a father figure, someone whose approval represented the validation of living according to principles that mattered. Mr. Miller, Marcus replied, everything I've achieved in the past 2 years has been built on the foundation of what you taught me. The willingness to listen, to learn, and to treat every person with respect. Those lessons changed my life. Robert smiled. But you were the one willing to listen and apply those lessons. Not everyone would have had the humility to acknowledge their mistakes and the commitment to change their approach. Hit subscribe and the notification bell because tomorrow we're sharing the story of what happened when these customer service principles were implemented in a struggling school district with results that amazed educators nationwide. The conference presentation was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, giving Marcus time to review his materials one final time. The presentation would cover the specific techniques of the Miller Method, but also the philosophical foundation that made those techniques effective. The recognition that every human interaction is an opportunity to demonstrate values of respect, dignity, and professional excellence. As Marcus prepared for what would be the most important presentation of his career, he thought about the audience that would be listening. Airline executives, customer service directors, training managers, and frontline employees from around the world would be learning about principles that had started with one conversation between a dismissed passenger and a young flight attendant who was willing to learn. Subscribe to our channel because we believe that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources and that every interaction is an opportunity to learn something that could change your life and career forever. The transformation that began in seat 23B had become something larger than anyone could have imagined. What started as a correction of poor customer service had evolved into a movement that was changing how entire industries thought about human dignity, professional excellence, and the power of treating every person with respect. But perhaps most importantly,
The Miller method had demonstrated that positive change was possible when people were willing to acknowledge their mistakes, learn from unexpected teachers, and commit to treating everyone they encountered with the dignity and respect that every human being deserved. Make sure you're subscribed because next week we're featuring an interview with passengers whose travel experiences were transformed by these principles, showing how excellent customer service creates loyalty that lasts for decades. As Marcus walked into the conference center, carrying the presentation that would share Robert Miller's wisdom with the world, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 years earlier, he had been a flight attendant who made assumptions about people based on their appearance. Today, he was a leader whose work was influencing how millions of people were being treated in their daily interactions with service providers. The elderly man in seat 23B had indeed changed everything, not just for Marcus, but for an entire industry and the countless people whose lives were touched by the principles of dignity, respect, and genuine human care that Robert Miller had spent his career developing and sharing. Subscribe right now to join thousands of others who are committed to making every interaction an opportunity to demonstrate respect, kindness, and professional excellence. These stories will inspire you to see the potential for positive change in every person you meet. The presentation would begin soon, and Marcus was ready to share the most important lesson of his career, that true customer service excellence begins with recognizing the humanity and dignity in every person we have the privilege to serve.